Hey there and welcome back to another Disney video. And recently, I made a video talking about the upcoming live-action adaptation of Pinocchio. And looking through the trailer, I was actually pretty excited for this film. It has a good director, Tom Hanks, a classic story, the Disney budget. What could go wrong? Unlike many folks, I don't really have much of a problem with the stream of live-action remakes that get trotted out by Disney year after year. After all, this is a business, and they make money for the company. Plus, they get the nostalgia flowing. And it's not like these are stopping Disney making other films. I mean, look at all the other stuff that they still release non-stop. These things just aren't setting them back all that much, especially now that they seem to be Disney Plus exclusives. So they aren't even clogging up the cinema release schedule. Are all of them good? No. Some of them truly suck. But some of them, at least in my eyes, are very fun. And I was hoping that Pinocchio was going to be one of these films. A fun time with great visuals and a classic story. Just one of those films that you watch and it makes you happy. And so I was very excited. I love Pinocchio. I recently rewatched the original animated classic. And then I saw the trailer and it had a lot of things I liked the look of and some things I was a little bit nervous about. And then the film released and woof, it was rough. Complete and utter trash in almost every respect. And by the look of the reviews, I don't think I'm alone in that opinion. On Rotten Tomatoes, as of writing this, it has an approval rating of 29% from critics and 39% from audiences, which is not good. In fact, it's worse than not good. It's a truly terrible score, with the overwhelming opinion being that it looks good, but that's about it. Otherwise, it's completely soulless. And I can't help but agree with that assessment, because it is soulless. It looks very beautiful, the sets are great, the character designs are great, the special effects for the most part are really well done except for Figaro and Cleo who look almost uncanny valley at times, but besides those two characters, the film looks very good. And I will admit that some of the performances themselves are good as well. I thought that Honest John was very well voiced, that Stromboli was well acted, the kid who voiced Pinocchio sounded pretty spot on in terms of sounding like the original performance, and maybe there were some other decent showings, but I can't really remember them. They didn't stick in the mind. Oh, and I also enjoyed them fleshing out Geppetto's backstory. It doesn't really add that much to the actual story itself, but it does flesh out the character in an interesting way, with him having a dead wife and child. It explains why he made the puppet to begin with, and why this story even happened. But apart from that, there is not much to like about the film at all. At times, it's almost a complete and utter rehash of the original, but worse. And then at other times, they just add or change things that actively damage the quality of the film. This whole thing's just a swing and a miss. And so, it's time for some negatives. And we'll pick up from where we left off with the positives and start with some performances. There were some really bad performances in this film. The Blue Fairy herself lacked any sort of impact, and instead of feeling wise and mystical, felt quirky and confused. Lampwick, well, the less said about him, the better, I think. His performance was distractingly bad. And thus, the scene where he turns into a donkey went from terrifying in the original cartoon to kind of cringe here. Jiminy Cricket. Oh, Jiminy Cricket. It was literally the original version, but done worse. The voice here was less convincing, and it felt very, very fake. Like an obvious fake voice, as opposed to the original where it feels more natural. And then we come to Geppetto, and this felt like Tom Hanks phoning it in for the paycheck. I tell you what, this has got to be one of his all-time worst performances. And I will hear no thoughts to the contrary. Because whether you think it comes down to poor acting, poor directing, or simply a terrible script, one thing is clear. The scenes where Geppetto is the main focus are some of the worst in the film. It just completely sucks me out of the immersion. His accent was bad, his mannerisms were weird, and he really just seemed like a demented caricature at times. Look how they massacred my boy! But really, the portrayals are only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to this festering turd of a film. There's so much more that really turns what should have been a magical and nostalgic experience into an hour and 40 minutes of pain and suffering. And so we'll move on to the storyline, and there's just so much to dislike. Okay, for starters, the Blue Fairy appears once and then never again. Literally never again. And you might think, wow, who cares about the Blue Fairy? Well, I do. This character is the reason the story even happens. She brings Pinocchio to life and tells him what he needs to do to earn his humanity. She fixes his nose when he succumbs to the temptation of lying and hiding his guilt, and then turns him real after he makes the ultimate sacrifice at the end of the film. But here, one of the most iconic characters in Disney canon is turned into an afterthought. And so whilst this probably wasn't the worst change they made, it was a troubling first sign. Like I said earlier, Geppetto is simply hard to watch in this film, so simply by association his story becomes actively worse and far less enjoyable. And then they add a really random side story of a puppeteer in Stromboli's troupe who befriends Pinocchio with the help of her own puppet. And I guess this was added to help pad out the runtime, but yeah, her existence adds nothing to the film whatsoever. But once again, these aren't really the most egregious failures from a story perspective. They're minor blunders that all add up to slowly bring down the overall quality. But I think they could have been counterbalanced by a solid main story, a good character arc for Pinocchio. But that's not what we get. Instead, we get one of the worst reimaginings for a classic Disney character ever. This version of Pinocchio reads like some fans' fix-it fan fiction, where Pinocchio is never in the wrong and faces no consequences, complete with lame messaging at the end. And so, let's dig a little bit deeper. Pinocchio's Arc, it's like they sort of watched the original film, but felt like a child who was literally born yesterday would have more common sense, and so they completely missed the point of his story. The point of the character is that he's easily manipulated into giving into his bad impulses because he's just been born. And thus, he really has to work hard to earn his humanity because he keeps making more and more mistakes. In the original, first he gives up his quest to go to school to pursue fame and fortune as a member of Stromboli's troupe after a little bit of light persuasion by Honest John. But here, he actually gets rejected from going to school, and thus he wants to impress Geppetto and make him proud by earning some money and fame. And so it's no longer really about him being naive and foolish and selfish, but more about feeling rejected and scared. And thus, he wants to prove himself to his father. Moving on though, instead of needing to be bailed out by the Blue Fairy and Jiminy because of his terrible choices, he manages to figure out the lying thing all by himself and retrieves the key to his cage by himself and fixes his nose by himself. I mean, yeah, Jiminy Cricket's there, but he's really a non-factor in the scene, apart from actually unlocking the cage. Pinocchio does everything else himself. And then he completely learns his lesson and doesn't relapse into his bad behaviours, which once again goes against the point of the story. He's meant to go on the selfish jaunt to Pleasure Island, to get a reality check with the donkeys, and then realise that his selfishness has gotten his father eaten by a massive whale. Here though, it's not really his fault, he kind of gets kidnapped, and he doesn't want to partake in hooliganism at all. He's a good little boy who does everything right, and everything that happens to him is just really bad luck. At least Pleasure Island ended up looking cool because the story itself didn't hit quite right. But more on that later. And so we come to the Monstro storyline, but once again, not really much to say about this. The point of this was to give Pinocchio a chance to prove himself brave, truthful, and unselfish. To sacrifice himself for his father to earn his humanity. And here, well, nothing's his fault. And there isn't even a sacrifice. It's a terrible ending to cap off a woeful story arc for the character. It just takes the original and makes it actively worse. That's all it does. I would have respected it far more if they just took the story and changed it completely, as opposed to having it be close enough to the classic version, only bad. I don't understand why these changes were made. Because now Pinocchio's no longer growing through each mini adventure. He's basically a victim the entire way through, and there's no reason to learn, as the majority of things that happen to him throughout the story are not his fault to begin with. He has no reason to change. And I find that truly absurd. But of course, beyond that, it's not the only element of the narrative that I found to be terribly lacking. I also just felt like the tone in the latter half of the film was off. Because despite there being a lot of issues with the story, the wheels don't really completely fall off until we arrive at Pleasure Island. Because like I said, Pinocchio decides he doesn't really like this place instantly. But beyond that, you sort of lose that sense of foreboding. In the animated version, the aftermath of this storyline is bleak and depressing. The kids are being turned into donkeys and sold off. That's pretty brutal. But this adaptation just doesn't have that same impact, due to the acting for Lampwick being really choppy for the transformation scene, but also because we don't really see all that much of the donkeys from Jiminy's perspective, so you don't get as much of that fear that Pinocchio's going to be next. It doesn't have the same narrative oomph. And it's the same with Monstro. Despite being Monstro more detailed and fantastical than ever before, in the live-action version, this whole sequence just ain't it. The whole sequence feels rushed. Instead of Pinocchio going to hunt down Monstro and finding this immense Goliath whale at the bottom of the sea, and then having to try and escape in what is one of Disney's most frightening scenes ever, you just have them get eaten out of nowhere. And then they instantly do the sneeze from the smoke, and then Pinocchio speedboats them away in a chase that is far less frightening than in the animated version. I mean, for starters, why the hell did they decide it would be a clear sunny day? They didn't even bother to set the scene properly. Would it have killed them to put in some stormy clouds? It's honestly a bit of a disgrace and kind of embarrassing. Also, they randomly made him a weirdo sea monster with tentacles because apparently giant whales are no longer all good. I mean, I doubt this scene would have created an uptick in whale meat sales, but okay. And so, the tentacles make him look a little bit silly, and I was drawn out of the scene by that as well, because instead of watching the chase properly, I was trying to figure out if he actually had tentacles coming out of his ass. Look, I really wanted to love this film. Watch my previous Pinocchio vids and you'd know. I really did want to give it a chance. I very much enjoy Pinocchio. But this ain't it. I just don't know what they were doing here. But it certainly wasn't making a Disney classic. Hell, it wasn't even making a good film. This thing is a travesty. And I think it's best if we all go back to pretending like it never existed in the first place. But anyway, with all that being said, these are just my opinions and now I'd like to hear yours. What did you think of the Pinocchio film? You like it, hate it, somewhere in between? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.